Good evening, everyone, and welcome to 70 Years After Bandung, Lessons for a New Global Order. I want to start by thanking Dr. Yusuf and the Middle East Council on Global Affairs in collaboration with Oxford University for prioritizing the 7-decade acknowledgement of the Bandung Conference. The landmark event was also known as the Asian African Conference and was likely one of the most overlooked diplomatic events of the 20th century, largely overlooked because of the countries involved. While the 29 countries may not have been aligned in their ideologies, they certainly were in their histories, as they championed a more inclusive and fair international system. Our panel this evening, I'll give you a brief format. It will consist of 3 focus areas of discussion with the Q&A session at the end. And just be aware that there is translation, Arabic and English. So I want to launch straight into introducing our esteemed panelists. Dr. Linda Chinenya Arulo is an assistant professor of international relations at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Qatar. She is also an associate at the German Institute for Global Area Studies, an associate research fellow at the United Nations Comparative Regional Integration Studies, and a resident fellow at the African Policy Research Initiative. Her research focuses on international relations, the role of bureaucrats in international organizations, African regional integration, post-colonial and decolonial theories, and Africa in global politics. Dr. Jamil Aden is a professor of modern global history at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. His research focuses on historical processes that shape transnational racial and civilizational identities, such as Muslim, Asian, and African. He explores new ways to understand the historical roots of the contemporary world order by describing the process of imperial era conflicts and decolonization, especially from the perspective of non Western actors of the Muslim world and East Asia. Other research interests include questions of internationalism and Orientalism, as well as modern world history. Dr. Faisal Devji is a professor of Indian history and fellow of St. Anthony's College at Oxford University. He is interested in the intellectual history and political thought of modern South Asia and in the emergence of Islam as a global category. His research focuses on the cultural and philosophical meanings of violence as much as the emergence of nonviolence as a political project. His recent works deal with efforts to think beyond the nation state and the inheritance of anarchism in the post colonial world. And Ghalib Dalai is a non resident senior fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. He is also an associate fellow at Chatham House and a doctoral researcher at Oxford University. Dalai's research focuses on regionalism and regional order in the Middle East, regional security, Turkish politics, Turkish foreign policy, post conflict stabilization, and peace building, the making of the modern Middle East, both global and historical processes, and the changing place of international powers like Russia, US, and Europe in the Middle East. So, thank you all for being here. The first thing I think that we need to understand is the Bandung Conference did not happen in a geopolitical silo. It solidified the movement's goals and principles in its quest to transform global dynamics. So let's start by, elaborating on this milieu of independence. And if we can start with you, Jamil, what preceded all of this?
Thank you for the introduction. Um, Suparno started the conference in his introductory remark. He said, uh, welcome to the first conference of the colored nations. And then he said, so-called the colored nations, to kind of qualify the participants of that conference is that and then he says that we are very different, but we have the experience of being racialized and colonized and subjugated. And I think the main framework of the conference going to the previous century of Asian and all of Asian and African societies have been colonized, but also their rights were deprived. They were racially subjected to different hierarchies of inequality. And we have to see the period from 1870s to the moment of Bandung, but beyond Bandung, 1960, as the process of the colonized societies not only asked for their emancipation, equality, and rights, but they also imagining a different world, a world without empire, a world without racial hierarchies. They have been working for this for a very long period of time. Um, this is, of course, is the first one where Asian and African societies were represented as nations. Previously, um, all the colonized societies will try to ask for rights in the imperial centers. They will go to London for roundtable conferences. They will petition, but they will also do underground organizing. So there could be three lines of previous, actually four, let me add four, one, two. There will be Pan-African organizing. There will be multiple Pan-African conferences, starting with, early on, but then going through the Paris Peace Conference and afterwards. There is a organizing and conferencing among Muslim societies, uh, most of which was 19 famous of which was the Jerusalem Congress. And Pakistan picked it up and created the Muslim World Conference in 1949. And of course, there's a zone of Asian societies also conferencing with each other, meeting, which was led eventually by Japan in 1943 as the kind of preceding conference of Asian countries, and India Inter-Asian Relations Conference. Fourth, that I shouldn't forget, is also there's a conferencing happening through socialist networks of uh, there's one that Sukarno himself referenced is the League Against Imperialism, and various socialist sponsored ones. In all of these conferences, of course, there is solidarity among people who were attending these conferences, offering solutions. And what we see in Bandung is that the new international order that is emerging after World War One and World War Two were seen incomplete, because the goal is the bigger goal is to complete humanity. And in World War One, after World War One, the so-called Wilsonianism promised things, but then didn't deliver. So-called the idea of self-determination and equality. And the most vivid example of it is the Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh in Paris trying to meet Woodrow Wilson, asking for rights, but then Woodrow Wilson not even responding to him. And then he then goes to Moscow. Um, and then as a background, of course, we have the United Nations. So all of these countries, except China and even Japan, could also meet at the United Nations, but they find the United Nations structure incomplete. Um, because the UN, they weren't there in the UN. They were, according to the metaphor that we will hear, is that they were at the table as a menu, but they were not sitting at the table of international order. So the Bandung is the first one to that for Asians and Africans are saying that we like the progress that is being shown, but it's an incomplete process. We want to fulfill this goal of emancipation, equality, and justice in the world. And we cannot ask for the mercy and the kindness of the white colonialists. We should do it ourselves with our own power. This is an attempt of creating solidarity, and it's an extraordinary achievement in that regard. That Indonesia was just became independent, and then they could just gather people in this place to offer an alternative to what they called an unjust world order. Maybe I stop here. Yes.
Yes, Faisal, just to go to you now in terms of the Cold War, that was a major factor.
Yes, I mean, you can't think of Bandung without the Cold War. Um, just as you can't think of the founding of the post 1945 international order without the Cold War, because the United Nations system is put together in order to allow for diplomatic and other relations to exist between the then prevailing blocs, the US dominated capitalist one and the Soviet dominated socialist one. And what's interesting about this international order and told on the emergence of Bandung and its famous or infamous spirit is that it had no place for zero sum games, interestingly, ideological agreement. So we tend to think of diplomacy in terms of agreement, but at the heart of the UN system was disagreement. Uh, Disagreement between the Soviet Union and the United States and their respective satellites and allies, but disagreements of other kinds as well. This was seen not as a problem, but as a positive thing by the nations that met in Bandung, who also disagreed with each other on many counts and were not similar, because their concern was precisely with maintaining and encouraging plurality within the international order. What they didn't want is a homogeneity of opinion, of uh, policy, uh, of anything that smacked what empires had done to their subject populations. Uh, Now, we find that strange to think about today because in the aftermath of the 1945 international order, arguably it lies in shambles before us today, uh, certainly from the end of the Cold War. Once you remove the enemy, the thing about the old international order is it depended upon having the enemy inside while maintaining his status or her status as an enemy. Uh, with the end of the Cold War, there is no longer an enemy of any substantial kind. And that allows for zero sum games. That allows for a brief decade of unipolarity, uh, and it increases wars rather than decreasing them as people had imagined fondly. Uh, so Bandung is fascinating because already at the inception of the international order, the post 1945 international order, its members wanted to maintain the political and other forms of plurality, the heart of that order and of Bandung itself. And that is why I think that is one reason why it has negativity built into it, not as a problem, but as an advantage. So, for instance, what comes out of Bandung is the non aligned movement, famously. It's a negative term, non aligned. It makes no positive claim on building an alternative understanding of the world which all its members shared. How could they share? Turkey became a member, it was a NATO member. It was hardly non aligned. Pakistan was similarly allied to the West. India was not. And the two were enemies. So you have this very interesting situation where Bandung mirrors, in some ways, what the UN was meant to be. It foreshadows it in some ways, and it mirrors it in other ways. So where there's UN's plurality was between two blocks. Bandung refused the idea of a block. That was another reason why it was negative in conception. It refused to become a third block. Uh, it tried to instantiate plurality in the international order without, of course, making for irreconcilable differences. So the idea of an international order allows for a give and take, allows for compromise, allows precisely for diplomacy, but refuses what they took to be the imperial vision of homogeneity.
They were under apartheid rule, and Zimbabwe was still Rhodesia. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so I will start with the fact that a lot of these African countries were invited. So they were not part of the organizing. And this is not to say that, African, independence leaders at the time couldn't organize one, but I would say they had a lot on their plate. We know that, with the Pan African Conference that changed to a Congress, started all the way from 1900, and the one that had the most African leaders' participation was in 1945. And then later on, there was the, All African Conference and the, Conference on Independence Days that all were talking about how do we push for independence. And another thing to note is that, before 1955, there was a whole lot of resistance going on. Like we can trace resistance on the continent to, decades before 1955. But in the context of 1955, so much was happening. Around that time, the Mau Mau rebellion was happening. Around the same time, the Algerian War was starting. Portuguese Guinea was resistant. The war hasn't started, but it was, there was huge resistance on that front. In South Africa, I know in 1955, the anti-CAS, resistance was happening. People were being moved out of Sophiatown and moved to Soweto. So this is the context of, 1955 and the continent at the time. So, and then comes this invitation from the Bandung Conference, four countries at a time that were independent, and that was Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and Libya. South Africa, of course, was not, invited because of how they felt towards apartheid. But I know that, the ANC, the African National, South African Indian Congress, had observers since then. And then there were you know, land, which is now present day Malawi, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. But again, we know how the context of that region was over the Portuguese Empire. Then that was, controlled by Salazar. They couldn't send anyone. So I think out of send a delegation, but others were able to be there. And that was how, most of these random
Thank you, Linda. Important to touch on who were the organizing parties and which were the organizing countries. So what the non-alignment movement looked like back then?
Well, the five organizers from Myanmar and Indonesia, the host countries, and as you said it, all of them were the Asian states rather than the name of the Bandung was Asian African Conference. So it was not the Bandung later. I think what Bandung did was one of the most it gave or it popularized some of the new vocabularies. For instance, the spirits, so and so forth. So you have all these new concept vocabularies that allow us to have a new things, irrespective of whether those terms stand up or the test of the time or not. But this term, up until today, has become one of the integral part of this narrative and then the language part. The second, exactly non-alignment that was born out of the Bandung. It was not in Bandung, so it came later because it was also showcased 61. So therefore, like the time of the Bandung, but nevertheless, it became like it had its version on the international politics than the Bandung itself. But not everyone meant the same thing with non-alignment watch, or not everyone expected Tito that wanted to turn this into a movement in a sense, like it's a third Soviets, the Western Bloc, or you have like people like Nehru that did not want to turn into a bloc rather than to remain as a principle. Misconception that we have about this non-alignment, many people equate it with equidistance or neutrality or passivity. It was none of that. So it was not equidistance. It was not about neutrality. It was not about passivity. It was more rejection of the prevailing true vision of internationalism that was represented by two competing powers of the international system then. So the Soviet vision of internationalism or the socialist vision of internationalism or the Western or the US centric vision of internationalism, non-alignment in a sense was the rejection of this true vision of internationalism. It did not offer its own version of internationalism. It offered the element, the principle, but I think it would be very difficult to talk about, like, a, a comprehensive, cohesive vision of international order that was born out of it. You have the 10 principle of bonding spirit that was obviously very powerful principles, but it's very difficult to create and vision of internationalism out of it. But nevertheless, the Bandung was not about equal distance to the matters. I think it was like the rejection of the two world view that was propagated by the two power centers of the world. The other thing is that we should bear in mind when we talk about the non-alignment that it was a normative position. So it was not just a policy position; it was a normative position. It set on certain values that came out of shared common history because all the countries there, if you set aside countries like Turkey, I mean, obviously Turkey went there as a result of very specific circumstances, but put this aside, most of the countries there were the post-colonial states. So they had the first-hand experience of oppression, the suppression, the hierarchy of international system. So in a sense, it rested on a certain principles that came out of their shared history that they experienced. But it did not extend to their shared vision of the international order. So there was a normative framework that was informed by their shared interest, shared history, but this did not go into that. And I think how it relates to today, the last part of your question, today the systemic condition that gave birth to the Bandung is no longer there, or the non-alignment, because it was the product of Cold War, bipolarity, and decolonization. And none of them is relevant as it is today. And today's, when we discuss the non-alignment, you have the countries that is actually even talking about non-alignment 2.0. They meant is multi-alignments. But the multi-alignment is not a principled position. It's a policy position. It's not about the vision of the international system. It's about what you take, what's your policy position on certain issues. Because on certain issues, you align with ABCD country. On another issues, you align with BCD countries. So therefore, it's more non-alignment was a normative history. Multi-alignment is more of a hedging strategy. It's also in anticipation of multipolarity in the world because the condition that multipolar. We are not there. I think the multipolarity in international the way there, but we are not there. But multi-alignment is a factor of it. And the final point, I think one huge outcome of the non-alignment was it prevented the polarity that it already was because not joining the competing blocks also became like worldwide phenomenon.
Yeah, I think what you touched on there was very important. And in terms of what you spoke about, the spirit of Bandung. So the conference, I think, like hopes to work together, hopes for bilateral ties,
Absolutely.
maybe. But but despite some
Yeah.
fractures, I think it was the beginnings of actually. Can you tell me why this was so relevant, particularly the Cold War?
The conference for marking the anniversary, and we had a T-shirt Indonesian colleagues, and I agree with that. I think there is a bigger relevance of Bandung. So even though the countries that gathered in the Bandung Conference order, meaning that they wanted peace, but they also wanted justice with the peace. These were countries not part of the old empires. In fact, Sukarno calls this that we have nothing. And these values, of course, became very important in the sense 1960 United Nations resolution. Um, and during Bandung, there were anti-colonial wars going on. Empires during War of Independence just starting, and Bandung invited Algerian delegation, and in fact, and draw their flag. When we get to 19th, colonialism is a moral sin. Colonialism and racism of the Afro-Asian countries. The dominant narrative that we think is absolutely mistaken, that exists, is that Europe was great, Europe and the West. They had some problems like colonialism, but only with hit that they need a war, modern international order. That's of course not accurate, meaning that in Bandung had the experience of colonization and oppression. They were the ones who actually forced greater powers with as much justice and equality. Not ideal that they imagined, and they were still incomplete beginning of decolonization. But it's their achievements, and that's how we should teach it. In that context, I want to note that Cold War wasn't everything. East and West is something that the Bandung countries rejected. Right, who was there as an observer, and he titled his book "The Color Curtain," indicating that the Iron Curtain that help us understand the world, that the experience of being colonized, the color curtain, is actually as important. So the South emerges as a kind of moral force. They will be divided. But the relevance that I see also, since we are in an Arab, and the importance of the Arab countries should be highlighted in this process, because they are linking Asian societies with Africa and the non-Muslim Asian societies. Vision about the future, which was articulated by the full decolonization of the world. So there will be exceptions, that they will be very, and a more equitable order. So what we think happened at the end of the Cold War, that America think that they have a victory over, as a West, victory over the East. But in reality, this victory over the global South, meaning that this the Palestinian question with Kissinger and the Camp David is that Palestinian liberation, and there are many other issues such as apartheid and similar other independence movements, were suppressed by the West. Ones in this room will remember that there was a big slogan of the kind of Islamic internationalists, which Islam is the solution. I think the Bandung spirit will be that neither East nor West, the global South will be solution. And I think when that failed, that there's this kind of Arab Islamic redefinition, that after the Cold War, when America emerged as the only superpower, and European, neither East nor South, global West will deliver all the good liberal values, and they haven't. The international order is more chaotic, more violent, and more unjust than ever compared to 1990. And we have been dealing with the results of the Cold War, especially after the kind of war on terror, of an interest in Bandung, and that's why it's more relevant than ever. Right?
Yeah, when Bandung happened, um, that occurred at a time when had to deal with the emergence of a new international order. They were simultaneously hopeful of it. I think, for instance, of the time when India took the case to the UN. It's one of the earliest cases. The Palestinian case and the Indian-Pakistani case are the two oldest ones. But Gandhi didn't want him to do that. Gandhi distrusted the UN. He wanted India to participate in it, but he feared that American powers, it could play the role that the British Empire had played amongst its subjects, claiming to be a neutral arbiter, but pitting each one. And this would allow its integrity and its sovereignty and become a site for proxy wars. Alongside it. Who is to say Gandhi was not right? He said, I would prefer a war between India and Pakistan. This is the apostle of knowledge. Offers us more hope that we will come to settle our differences ourselves rather than have a bunch the last 200-300 years. So you see the degree of suspicion of the emerging international order, and yet at the same time, because it was about including the enemy. Today, the order that was being given birth then is now, possibly coming to an place with a strangely similar question, though in very different circumstances. So on the one hand, are the most assiduous defenders of the international order. The so-called revisionist powers are actually, they also want its reform. They don't just want to save it for what it is. If you will, understanding of politics that had back to our world. Now, let me briefly say that when I use the, when you think, for instance, of Indian political thought, Mahatma Gandhi again, categories non-violence, non-cooperation, because Gandhi argued that the positive vision of doing something was negative, was a philosophical position that allowed people to think of what was already endemic to the human condition. So satyagraha, yeah. So today we are in an analogous situation because many countries, especially those in the global south, adopting what you might call a negative position, refusal, abstention, say in the unwillingness to take sides, whether it is on Ukraine or Gaza, not because there is any ideological commitment either with Russia or with, but because these forms of refusal are a way, another way of thinking about international order, which doesn't yet have a name. Goes back to what Ghalib ways. A principle that was once fundamental to any conception of diplomacy, neutrality, disappeared with the end of the Cold War, when it was all about zero-sum games. You had to be for us or against us. Instead of bringing it back. Again, Ukraine and Gaza. And what I find fascinating about the return of neutrality is that it allows for of conflict, and it allows them also to mediate between enemies. Actions and are crucial to any traditional conception of diplomacy. Neutrality since the end of the Cold War, and certainly with the, as Jamil was mentioning, with the war on terror. Something that bears more thought. So I think the reliance on these forms of negative positioning might be stirrings of a new vision of the future.
Talk about system. So how would you compare the middle powers of today to the majority powers at Bandung?
To Bandung, what it meant, what it was in many ways, but I think it's important to look at what was the core message of Bandung. Try to come up with the nice vocabularies of the international politics, but our Indonesian colleague and host put it in a much nicer way. Not only the countries that did not want to be on the menu, they want to sit around the table. Not only to make the menu, they want to eat it as well. So I was going to say they wanted agents politics, they want to be the shaper of the international system, benefit from it. But I think that description, so these countries want to be not a bystander, not just an onlooker. They want to shape the international politics fundamentally and benefit from it. I think that is Cemil Hoca also initially referred to it. Because up until then, imagine where were the big meetings about the global order was taking place, world order were taking place. It would be in former European imperial capitals. You would go to London, you would go to Paris, you would go somewhere else. The fact that it took place in Bandung, in Indonesia, in an Asian state in itself was reflecting the political psychology of the moment. That the former colonial actors, the post-colonial states, are taking the matters not of their own, but the future of the world order into their hands. So there is a new political psychology because it's not only about themselves, it was about the global order, how to remake the world, how to remake the international system. So I think that was the core political psychology that informed the Bandung. And I think that was key that this event took place in Bandung, not in London, not in Paris, not in in Moscow or elsewhere. I think that then the spirit of Bandung that is like very much referred to it is still very pertinent and resonant, and obviously that involved the solidarity elements, the cooperation between the countries of Asian and African states that shared, they had like a shared history of oppression in the hands of the imperial masters, and then the idea of the independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, mutual respect, so on and so forth. Those were all like formed a very important, with also Bandung principles, an important spirit among the participants, and also it lived on for a long time. I think, and also that also brings us to the legacy part. The legacy part, I think, most importantly, creating an international consensus among the principles that were put forward in Bandung. No one is going to dispute and debate in today's world the 10 principles that were put forward in Bandung. But
Khaled, if you don't mind me interrupting you, because I'd love to touch on these principles and when we talk about lessons learned, if that's okay with you. I would love to ask Linda now about, movements on the African continent and how these were impacted post the event.
Yeah. So like again, I would like to go back to what was happening even before the Asian African Conference, the Bandung Conference. The fact that there were so many, the Pan-African, conferences and the congresses were strong. There was a lot more banding together on the continents towards fighting decolonization, but this comes from other roots of racialization on the continent. And I'll give an example with the story of Kenneth Kaunda, because it goes back to what you said, Galip, about being part of the menu, being at a table, wanting to be on the menu and talking about the menu at the same time. All of that, the conversation about African colonization and the Berlin Conference was that the analogy usually uses like this piece of cake, and like the colonial master over it with a knife and chopping it up. And that was the idea of the continent, a place where there were resources but without people. So the first thing that Africans were fighting was not just self-determination and the possibility of governing their countries, but it was being seen as human. And I remember, Kenneth Kaunda has this, story of what inspired him to go into independence, resistance movements and fights, was when he was a younger man. He went to buy bread at a store, and the storekeeper shouted at him just because he walked through the door. And he was like, "Why did you walk through the door? You're not supposed to walk through the door." And he made him go through the pigeonhole, which was where the blacks of Zambia had to buy, get their foodstuff from. So he said that was what inspired him to go. So first of all, it was to fight to be recognized as human, first of all. So, the Bandung Conference, yes, happened, and they were invited in 1955 to have this conversation, but there was already a fire going on even before 1955 on the continent. And I think that they already had that spirit and the principles of Bandung even going to, to the conference itself. Because we see Kwame Nkrumah later on organizing the Conference of Independent States and inviting the few independent states at a time to talk about how do we help these other states decolonize. And then the All African Conference comes later in 1958 in December. And we can see how several of these, African states have helped to decolonize the continent. It's funny that we're the the South African and the Nigerian on the panel, because I feel like these two member states are like siblings that banter a
Yeah.
lot. And I know that there are so many conversations between South Africans and Nigerians on social media. And I remember something happened at a time, and Nigerians had to remind South Africans, "This is what we did for you during apartheid."
Yeah.
The fact that they were,
Nigeria is
in
not
high schools and, paid dues in order to pay for fighters, ANC fighters, to either be, to go to Algeria or to go to Egypt to be trained, opening borders for them to pass and escape and be trained, and, propagandas being, shared around to educate people about decolonization. These things were already happening, like resistance were going on, and after Bandung, it continued strongly. And that was what led to the Organization of African Unity in 1963, and now the African Union with 55 member states on the continent. So I think that they had that spirit of the Bandung, and it's continued. Although, ask me questions about how is it going today with the member states of the African Union, I would have a different answer for you. But I think they already had that spirit, and it was strong even after the conference.
Great, thank you. Philip, so let's go back to you now, because my third question is about, this reshaping of global affairs, and many avoid binary choices. So, what are the lessons learned from the Bandung Conference 70 years on?
I think one thing that was very, uh, very important, the defense of the UN Charter in Bandung. So there was a very strong defense of the UN Charter. The Bandung took place in 1945 and 55. The UN was created in 1945. So therefore, they were not architect of this charter, but they embrace it because that was I think, the only globally appealing framework for a new international system that was premised on equality, justice, and somewhat of a normative and human rights framework. So therefore, they defended it. I think today's middle powers, one thing that should be very crucial is the defense of the international order should be the key element, the key common denominator of the middle powers. Because the superpowers never likes the law. They never like the international law. They never like the international norms because they see them as constraints on their power. They see them as headache and nuisances. But the middle powers cannot do without the international law norms because they don't have enough power to navigate the world without some predictability and norms. So therefore, the defense of the international law should form the core of the middle powers' vision of internationalism today when they look at it. Because without that, they will be squeezed in a G2 world of the US and China. If you want to prevent the G2 world of the US and China, first and foremost, insist in norms, insist on institution, insist on the legal order, international law, and I think that's it. The secondly, the champion, neither US nor China will be the champion of the normative champion of the world. I think the normative championship of the world should come from the middle powers, and obviously we're already seeing many things of that kinds. I mean, during the Gaza war, during the Gaza, the South African case against Israel. You also has the similar cases during the Ukraine. So in a sense, you already do see this happening. And I think the final element probably should be not only reject a G2 world of the US and China, reject the not multipolarity, but multi-ordering. Because what we see in the absence of an international law, in the absence of some norms and laws, what we are going is not multipolarity. What we are going in world politics is multi-ordering, some form of sphere of influence logic prevailing over certain regional constellations. And that means the decline of norms, the decline of any universal aspiration. And I think that would be equally dangerous. And that's why the institution or platform such as BRICS today cannot provide a common vision. It can provide a powerful alternative narrative, but not a powerful alternative political project to make a new international order. It risks at a time the non-alignment rejected the neither being US centric or Russia centric or the Soviet centric. I think the BRICS risk to be China centric. And the moral clarity of non alignment is being compromised in BRICS because the sovereignty, the territorial integrity was part of the non alignment. Now you have one of the member of the BRICS, Russia, that is tasting this, the Georgian War, 2014, Crimea, and Ukraine. So this principle is being already severely compromised within the BRICS. So therefore, a new constellation headed not by China, Russia, US, but middle powers in defense of international norms and laws.
Do you agree, Jamil, or do you have something to add? And you also propose some solutions, don't you?
I mean, yes, we do need solution. I mean, I think as a historian, I could look back and see that no one would thought that it will be as bad as today, meaning that all the nationalist leaders in Bandung countries, visionaries, always believed that they will struggle, they will fight against colonialism, they will support each other, and eventually they will create some sort of a better, peaceful, just world order. And they more or less believed in what Martin Luther King Jr. said, that the moral arc of history is long, but it will bend towards justice. Well, what we have seen in the last 30 years that after the war on terror, no arc is left. They even bombed the arc. There's nothing. I mean, this what's happening in Palestine is unimaginable. There's a sort of clear case of a genocide, and no international institution is hearing. Europe and America is practically making it impossible with their military power and the political power, impossible to save the Palestinians with some sort of just solution. So there is need for all Bandung powers to get together, collaborate. What we see, of course, is that because of the idea of self-interest and what happened among them, there is some sort of a fitna or division in the Afro-Asian countries. The old unity is hard to achieve. And the Arab work, maybe my last comment, is that they were the core of that Operation Unity. They were very important. But when I look back, um, that there was some sort of a mission for the Arab countries to be the glue to link Africa and Asia and take that leadership. And maybe we also need to think about the kind of unity in the Arab world to go back to that level of leadership in the new, or hopefully better international world.
Thank you. Linda or Faisal, in terms of the lessons learned post-conference?
I mean, there have been, there continue to be attempts to reform the international order. They seem a bit quixotic at a time when the UN itself has lost a great deal of not just credibility, but visibility.
Mm.
Uh, Nevertheless, uh, they are worthy of attention. Now, most of the focus is on the Security Council for good reason, because, of course, the Security Council, with its veto wielding members, is capable of progressing or halting any decision at the UN. And the Security Council is the way it is precisely in order to keep great powers in the game and not have them, as Ghalib was suggesting, just exit the system altogether. Only by giving them a veto was that possible. Otherwise, you would have no. And so that fundamental inequality of power and wealth is built into the system, and its founders saw no other way of including everyone within it. Um, Now, the what we call global South countries today, that time emphasized the importance of the General Assembly. And indeed, people like Nehru fought very hard and succeeded, in part. Mark Mazzaro, the historian, has written about this, in making the General Assembly a much more vibrant and viable space. But of course, it still doesn't have the kind of power wielded by the Security Council. So all calls for reform are calls for inclusion into the Security Council. That is a highly limited way of thinking about the situation. And when you think about who is slated for inclusion, interestingly, no one is excluded, though you would argue that Britain and France should no longer be there because they no longer have the status that they had at the end of the Second World War, as France was not a victor of the war, but Britain certainly was. Um, a recent UK white paper on this suggests that Japan and Germany should be included. So now not just the original winners of the war, but the losers of the war as well are to be included, along with, of course, India and Brazil, with Africa having a rotating seat. I asked the minister concerned that surely, I mean, if you think about regional representation, you really need at least one member from permanent from the Middle East, one from Southeast Asia, and I would argue two from Africa, say Nigeria. And maybe not Japan and Germany, yet another European member, and think about excluding Britain and France, because his argument was, oh, it'll be unwieldy, you can't have too many members. I said, well, there are people who can also be taken off this. Well, this is my joking. Obviously, I didn't expect to be taken seriously, but my point was that there has to be a logic to this. You can't just maintain members whose relevance is no longer clear and add others that balance, so Japan and Germany are meant to balance off India and Brazil very clearly. So even in that limited way, we have a necessary debate, but not one that is particularly earth-shattering. And the problem with it, of course, is also the process of inclusion gets these new members invested in the existing system, and so they are unwilling to want to change other bits of it. So in my view, if we are sticking to the UN system in some form, because it's the only one that exists, then we have to think not just of the Security Council, but of the General Assembly as well, keeping in mind power disparities. It is never going to be an equal system. But the point of the international order and of diplomacy is to manage through forms of compromise and trade-offs uh, the inequality that's inherent uh, in around the globe. There is no such thing as an equal they are, you know, everyone is supposedly legally equal, but we know the world doesn't work like that.
And
Yeah, I also agree that the United Nations is the only, like, is a world international organization that we have, and we have to work through it. But I'm a little bit pessimistic about the UNSC. Like, I don't know if and when it would ever be reformed. There's the winning consensus from the African Union has been a conversation since 2005. Nothing has been done. And I know that in order to pass a bill to reform the UNSC, it would still need to go through the so-called big powers or established powers. And yeah, like, I don't see that happening anytime soon. I think that, from although that, for me, the African Union has a lot of its flaws. I think from the start they knew that they couldn't be dependent on international organizations, and I think that was why forming the African Union was very important. That was why having the African group of states within, banding together within the United Nations, very important. That was why having an office of the African group of states within the United Nations was also very important. And looking back on what's, thinking about the Bandung spirit and um, how it fostered on the continent after that. Like, Nkrumah actually tried to unite the continent. There was a conversation of, an African state with a single foreign policy and a single, economy and all of that. But some other states didn't want this. And the conversation about, like, neutrality and just being able to have self-determination to choose the economic path that your states wanted, he knew that that would be a problem. And we can see throughout, the experience of the African continent, that that was a problem. When Thomas Sankara led, in the 1980s, and he came up with a brilliant economic, pathway for his country in Burkina Faso, what happened? He was killed off. Amilcar Cabral had, great ideas like educating population that was just 1% literate to, about, 50%, literacy by the time that they started their movement. But what happened? He was killed off. Patrice Lumumba, when he, spoke against, some of these policies, what happened? He was killed off. Samora Machel, like, name that, like, you know, I I have this class on African political thought, and we go through the thinkers and economic policies at the time, and students would be like, "Why is it that all of them are, most of them are dead?" I'm like, "Yeah, we can talk about that." And if you trace it back again, it's back to Western interference on the continent, and that was why the move for a single economy, a single foreign policy was very important at the time, hasn't been realized. We have the African, Continental Free Trade Agreement right now, which is, kind of like a form of, um, you know, creating a common market across the continent. It's still at its beginnings, but it still hasn't fully materialized. And I think that, maybe starting from the regionals to the international to the global might be a good place to go. Starting with creating a closer collaboration within the African continent with, Asian countries, with, Arab countries, strengthening the G7 77. That could be ways that we can, move from regional to the global.
excellent. Thank you so much. I really appreciate all your insights on how the conference and it's made its significance on global reform. But, you know, excellent that we've finished at 1:15 because we have time for questions from the audience. And because we don't have our notepads with us, we'll take one at a time if that's okay. So do we have any questions?
Good evening. Good evening. My name is Deepak. I'm a geopolitical analyst and I work with the Manai Corporation here. So, one of the unexpected outcomes, as some would say, of the Bandung was the emergence of Zhao Enlai, the Chinese premier, back then as a fine, diplomat. Because initially, many of the countries had skepticism in letting China into the Bandung. Ironically, it was Nehru who persuaded them. Uh, and he was able to give a message of conciliation, of collaboration, of coexistence. Now, if you look back, if you look at what's happening today, you see that China is on the Premier Xi Jinping is on a Southeast Asia tour, spreading a different message. I mean, a message wherein he's talking about mutual respect, of economic collaboration, and everything. Now, although these are both completely different, one is a normative position. I talk about Bandung, whereas the Xi Jinping's current trip is born out of great power rivalries. But having said that, do you think there is any kind of legacy that Bandung plays, or can you draw any parallels to that, especially in Southeast Asia? Thank you.
Faisal, I think, would you like to take that to start with?
Nehru enabled China's inclusion in the UN system and in the Security Council. So very different from India's position with Russia today. And I'll say why. So I inclusion, he recognized that it only be accomplished in a plurality of within a plurality of great powers. And therefore, in order in the international order, countries like China also needed to be there. India's position on Russia is, I would, whether it's vis-a-vis the Ukraine war or anything else, it's not an ideological agreement or a military agreement with Russia or India's alleged dependence on Russia. For a pluralistic international order to emerge, Russia has to be its weaponry, its strength, and all that, and its economy, which has been much derided, but is still not a negligible one. So, in that sense, the Nehru's position on China in the 1950s and 60s, heresy to say this, but in Modi's vision of Russia today, actually share much more than we tend to imagine, thought of in geopolitical terms, future status as a great power.
I mean, maybe just echoing, I think what a very similar position today, I would say, as you said, like the India is wants Russia to be there, but rather it's a to emerge on the world stage. And I used to get a question about where does Turkey, and I used to say Turkey is pro Russia to win, but it doesn't want Russia to lose as well. It doesn't want Russia wins. That's in Black Sea. That is going to pose the long-term geopolitical threat to Turkey. But if Russia loses, and that's an unchecked Western resurgence in more and more difficult for a multiple to emerge, which would have, which is increased. So in a sense, it's not like what it is about Russia. It's actually about themselves. So what kind of a world order will be more beneficial? It is a multipolar or it's a plural world system in which you will have a greater room for maneuver. Otherwise, the Western unchecked Western resurgence and further maintenance of the Western.
Thank you. In the spirit of what Faisal invoked as the negative dialectic of emancipatory potentials, I think my question first is what can we unlearn from the Bandung? In relation to that, we talked about, or you talked about the Bandung spirit. What can we say about the Bandung material? Very much centers on very even ship various material demand global south relations.
I can start. What can we unlearn? I think that's a good question. I think what we can unlearn is um, what we need to unlearn is having principles without actionable way to implement it. Because, like we said, we've been calling it a spirit, principles. So how has it continued today? We don't actually see that. I think, from my perspective, as someone who researches African regionalism, I think there's actually been um, a lot more suspicious states. Unlike the relationship of African member states with its former colonial powers, um, relationship with states of, global South, in Asia, in Latin America, and the Arab. We need to stop um, creating principles, which is still a problem today, even within the African Union, where they are so but there are no actionable, uh, plans set up to implement these policies. So this is one thing I hope we can unlearn. I don't think so far a lot of these member states have done that. But yeah, like Bandung Conference.
Jamil.
I should say, because of their long history of being weak and bullied and between morality, values, and power, that many of them, even before Bandung, they will say, we talk back and we are morality, but we don't have power. That by talking, being right, we don't change anything. And that's why they move to the next stage, that we need solidarity. Solidarity becomes very important. And the third stage, of course, is also play the geopolitics, that finding a powerful actor who will support you. It's this question of interest and of the medium powers who can do so, that all the Bandung speakers are actually going into this question, that there is no identity. He says, what harm in diversity? And then he moves on, because the only thing that unites us is our experience. But the third thing he says, better moral utopia, moral humanism, help its injustices. And I think that's what they're trying to do, that all these countries don't have some sort of power through solidarity, which also worked. I mean, they did speed up the decolonization. How many years, we don't know, but without the Bandung, will be much delayed or may not have happened. So their achievements are immense. What we can on appealing to Europe good moral consciousness haven't worked. So most of them have the hypocrisy charge. They will say that Europe also like what you proclaimed, that you were trying to do enlightenment. And once, of course, the hypocrisy charge unites. Suppose good side of the West, that they could be united. And they did try to go beyond that. But one thing they regional powers articulate the suffering and the interest of, let's say, if there's a regional power of Africa, then they can defend African countries better. If there's a regional power among Arabs, then they can do something for the Arabs. And I thought about this. Whenever there is a kind of a local person being interviewed in Syria, Iraq, or Palestine, and the conversation will go like this: that there's after is al-Muttahida, where is United Nations? And they will start with United Nations, and where is international law? And then they will go down, where is the Arab world? Where is what these oppressed people know is that, international, if they had a protector, as for example, Ukraine was protected by European Union. European Union and America to protect them, that will work. So maybe one thing to unlearn is that their pure idealism didn't really solve the problem, that they may have thought more about thinking about of power and geopolitics in relation to morality, that you may need to rethink.
Than I do. She says you can remember more than one question. So let's take 3 questions from our audience, please. Had his hand up for a long time, and you, sir, please. None of the women in our audience have any questions. Professor Al Zain, I was waiting for.
Understand you use the word where is there something today in the new global order? Is there actually a global order now other than the are the only big in the world?
Okay. Is there a global order? And we'll take 2 more. Fine.
Okay, I have a question.
Yes, please. While we're walking to the.
I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
So, yeah, thank you for the input. My question was about the lesson learned from the 70 years after Bandung. So, wondering if there are any lessons learned to be applied to the genocide in Gaza. Coming from Algeria, I do believe that Bandung contributed to the decolonization. If you can talk through this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Abu Bakr. Regarding the veto power of the United Nations. And I was just thinking when I heard from the panelists talking about the restructuring of the United Nations, just trying to link it with the lessons learned from the Bandung Conference. Is it possible in such a way to, as a way, the Bandung Conference to really challenge some of these challenges? For example, in the veto powers, for example, in terms of the United States, when they have interest, they will veto it. When Russia has interest in a particular case or country, they will veto it. So is it possible in such a way, in form of solidarity, to challenge these, these problems? Or perhaps, is it possible, do you think, maybe, like the Global South can form another United Nations? Like,
Please, who would like to answer one of those 3, please? Or all of them?
Let me take the last one, since I was mentioned the veto. I mean, I really do think that I take the point that politicians and others make, that organization and its veto power, no international institution would be possible. Because one of the things you have to recognize in such an institution is precisely the disparity of power and resources. but that needs to be counterbalanced by something else. And I think that focusing only on the Security Council and adding members who have even more vetoes, which might make the veto system unworkable. If there are too many members, each one of whom has a veto, you can conceive of a kind of totally gridlocked Security Council, and that what that would mean is that all politics would actually occur outside the UN system, which it has been doing in essence since the end of the Cold War, right? Whether it was Yugoslavia, whatever view you have, or the war on terror, to say nothing about our current wars, these are not going through. There are certain votes that are put to the General Assembly, but uh, uh, these wars and conflicts are not in general going through the United Nations. Deployments of troops, peacekeepers. We are now discussing peacekeeping for Ukraine. No one's even mentioning the UN. It's extraordinary, given the fact that it's within the UN system that peacekeeping actually becomes a thing. We are talking about, should it be Britain and France and who else? It's all done outside the system. So I think over focusing on the Security Council runs the risk of really creating gridlock and allowing the UN to fall even more into desuetude. So to counterbalance that, I think you need to think about a more, perhaps a different field of action that is proper to the General Assembly. And that makes for a slightly more democratic system that, certain percentages of votes in the General Assembly should disqualify vetoes in the Security Council, even though the Security Council can still discuss those votes. But they may not be able to deploy vetoes for everything. So I think that kind of system, which is actually more in keeping with the kind of democratic system that parliamentary democracies have, where you have bicameral legislatures. You know, where I live, you have a House of Commons and a House of Lords, and the House of Lords is there to look over legislation that is passed in the House of Commons, and sometimes it sends it back, and sometimes. So we have a model for this in many of our own countries. It works. I don't see why it shouldn't work in something like the UN. So I think you really need two things. There's been too much of focus on who to let into the uh, club of the Security Council, and in letting them in, to make them members of the club, uh, in the hopes that they will forget about the General Assembly and simply behave like all the other members.
think, yeah, I think just combining, because these concepts have very much fit into each other. And a simple, like the things that trust them together, can you have an order without a power? And can you have the outcome also without collective power? Because the question of the question about do we have a global order, and the question about genocide, I think, and also what we can unlearn or learn from the Bandung, very much interlinked. I think one thing that we found in Bandung was the normative language, the language of value, is great to destroy something, but it's not sufficient to establish an alternative. Because even the Sukarno, in its in its opening speech, he talked about mobilizing mobilizing the moral violence of nations in favor of peace. Obviously, this is like a very powerful emphasis, and is very powerful in order to destroy the structure, to delegitimize the structures. But those kind of normative language was not sufficient to create it, because when you look at the two blocks, both of them had power centers. The Western bloc had US, the Soviet blocs had Russia, and then the third world did not have an equal power center. It was the rejection of it in the end, but unfortunately, that's why it was powerful narrative, but not a powerful political project that could bring in a new a new vision, a new version of the international system. And I think we come to there. I think what Gaza did is severely severely weaken the normative framework of the current international system, the Western centric current international system, the legitimacy of the system. But unfortunately, what could end this is power. So it's very much undermined, tainted, uh, delegitimize the Western-centric international system. But what we saw, the U.S., despite all our talk about the multipolarity within the context of the Middle East, no other power-centric could, could come close in terms of impact on Israel's wars, on its, on everywhere, not only Gaza and Lebanon, etc. No other power center could change the behavior as much as the US could. So, and therefore, right now, it's still, unfortunately, it delegitimized the West and the Western-centric international order, but it needs more than days it needs power to change, to end the genocide.
Hmm.
So therefore, it's still, unfortunately, the power that will matter.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, believe it or not. It's already past 7:30 and the time just flew, in my opinion. In terms of, clearly the scene was already set way before Bandung started. There were many movements that resulted, many lessons learned that you've been able to share with us. So thank you all for coming. Enjoy the rest of your evening, but don't be afraid to take these conversations offline. Those of you who still had questions, catch the panelists in the foyer and ask these questions. Thank you so much.